I remember when the fear machine said Barack Obama would put troops on our streets, declare martial law, and herd dissenters into FEMA camps. I was there for that era of talk radio prophecy and militia forum scripture, when every hurricane drill or National Guard exercise was read as a rehearsal for the end of American freedom. None of it happened under Obama. But the prophecy served its purpose. It rewired a generation to equate liberty with obedience to a coming strongman, so that when the boot arrived from the right, it would feel like patriotism instead of tyranny. You can't understand what's happening now without zooming the lens back a century. This didn't begin with a red hat. It began when money first decided it would no longer tolerate the constraints of democracy. The American Liberty League, bankrolled by Irénée DuPont and his peers, tried to break the New Deal and, if they'd gotten their way, install a friendly dictator. They failed, but they didn't vanish. They changed outfits. The isolationists branded themselves America First, laundering sympathy for fascism into a posture of prudence. Robert Welch Jr. carried that torch into the John Birch Society, where anti-communism became the universal solvent where anything that threatened concentrated wealth could be painted as a communist plot, and therefore as treason. In 1971, Lewis Powell wrote the movement its field manual: capture the courts, capture the campus, capture the media. Build an ecosystem that speaks with 1,000 voices but answers to the same patrons. Over the next half-century, the memo metastasized into think tanks, law and economy programs, the Federalist Society pipeline, talk radio, and later, the algorithmic outrage machine. The point wasn't persuasion in any honest sense. It was environment design. Change the air people breathe, and you change what they can imagine. That's the river I stumbled into as a teenager in 2007, when the tents that would soon be called the Tea Party were still pitched as a restoration of liberty. The slogans were broad enough to catch the unwary and the earnest. Anti-corruption, self-governance, take our country back. And once you were inside, the path narrowed into obedience. The forums and end-timer pulpits taught a simple story that government is the enemy, the left is the enemy, the press is the enemy. And when the reckoning comes, good men will have to do hard things. We were told to fear the camps and the soldiers and the federal jackboot, and we were drilled to recognize them only when they had the wrong flag. Then 2015 happened, and the movement found its avatar. Trump didn't invent the script. He inherited it fully formed. American carnage wasn't a diagnosis. It was a promise that the state would be repurposed as a weapon for those who had convinced themselves they were the only real people. The rhetoric we marinated in during the Obama years, borders as battlements, immigrants as invaders, journalists as enemies, became governing philosophy. The judges seated by the Powell strategy, the donor network built by the Liberty League's descendants, the propaganda machine perfected by the Birchers' grandchildren. All of it snapped into alignment behind a man who treated power as a license. Meanwhile, the machinery of control grew teeth. In the last decade, the data fusion fantasies of the security state were no longer fantasies. Palantir became the nervous system for investigations and deportations. AI for defense moved from slide decks to battlefields, where algorithms sorted bodies into targets and collateral at machine speed. Facial recognition, license plate readers, predictive policing, and watch lists were stitched together with the same cheerful euphemism, situational awareness. Abroad, especially in Palestine, the tools were tested without politically protected pushback. The lab conditions were perfect. A population with no shield, an endless state of emergency, and a media fog thick enough to hide the iteration cycle. What worked there could be exported anywhere. What failed would never be audited in public. By the time Trump returned in 2024, the groundwork was complete. The fantasies of 2008 had been reversed into reality. Troops in American streets no longer lived only in fever dreams. Guard units were federalized over governors' objections, and patrols appeared in cities that were supposed to be sovereign. The camps we'd spent a decade being warned about suddenly had addresses, repurposed bases, tent cities, migrant operations with bureaucratic names and military footprints. The policy vocabulary stayed careful, but the photos didn't. And while cable panels argued about definitions, the bed counts went up. But the crux is that the projection wasn't a rhetorical quirk. It was the operating principle. They accused the left of plotting tyranny to justify building the tools of tyranny. They screamed about globalists to distract from a century-long project of global oligarchy. They warned of a surveillance state to normalize one, then privatized it so it would be answerable to boardrooms instead of ballots. They rehearsed the story of government overreach so that when their government reached, their followers would salute. The merger that sealed it all was cultural and technological at once. The old money that birthed the Liberty League and the think tank archipelago fused with the technofeudalists who see people as rows in a database. The billionaire class found common cause with global autocrats, sharing both clients and tactics, information warfare, platform choke points, capital flight as leverage, and software that converts dissent into heat maps. The result is what I call the Axis of Endarkenment, not because it's a secret society in a smoky room, but because it functions like one. A self-aware alignment of interests and incentives coordinated across borders with a single aim: insulate wealth from accountability and automate the enforcement of that insulation. This is where the timeline bends into the future. They are building if we let them. The endgame is not simply permanent minority rule on a wounded planet. It is selective survival. Think Elysium, think Ready Player One. Strip out the allegory and you have their roadmap. Use the last window of cheap energy to construct lifeboats, orbital habitats, seasteads, fortified enclaves, and then stretch lifespans for the chosen with the very biotechnologies the public was told to fear. In that world, AI doesn't serve public abundance, it guards private immortality. Robots don't free humanity from drudgery, they free oligarchs from the need to tolerate the rest of us. The border between defense and policing dissolves into a mesh of drones, cameras, and models trained to assign probability to your right to breathe. If that sounds dramatic, remember the simple pattern from 2007 to 2025. Every nightmare they projected onto their enemies eventually appeared in their own hands. Camps, troops, blacklists, a leader above the law, a press cast as traitors, the language of freedom pressed into service as a uniform. Why would the pattern suddenly stop at orbit? Why would the class that openly dreams of Mars, O'Neill cylinders, and life extension suddenly rediscover civic duty the minute those dreams become technically feasible? They have spent a century building an order designed to remove the public from the loop. The point of the loop, finally, is to remove us. This is why I insist on the Great Filter Frame. The test before us is not whether a few thousand can survive the mess they created. The test is whether humanity as a whole crosses the bottleneck together. A species that lets an immortal priesthood of billionaires escape into gilded lifeboats while 8 billion choke on ash has not passed the filter. It has failed it. The continuity of human life is not a legal concept. It is a moral one. Either the arc of abundance extends to the many, or the arc is a noose around our future. None of this requires secret documents or hidden handshakes to see. It is visible in plain sight, stitched together from century-old memoranda, foundation grants, television studios, software demos, procurement contracts, and the casual arrogance of men who tell you every day what they intend to do. The business plot didn't die, it professionalized. The Liberty League didn't dissolve, it diversified. The Birch hysteria didn't vanish, it rebranded. The Powell Memo wasn't a memo, it was a constitution for oligarchy. MAGA wasn't a spasm, it was the mask finally slipping, the quiet part spoken loud by a movement confident that the guardrails had been sawed through. So when I say I've seen this with my own eyes, what I mean is that I lived through the pipeline that made it possible. I sat in the digital pews where apocalypse was sacrament. I heard the sermons about liberty that ended in submission. I watched the fear of imaginary camps lay the rebar for real ones. And then I watched the same men who promised to save America celebrate while soldiers patrolled American neighborhoods and databases sorted human beings like inventory. The good news, the only good news, is that nothing about this has the inevitability they preach. The technologies they hoard are tools. The systems they captured can be rebuilt. The words they stole can be reclaimed. But there is a clock, and it isn't set to the next election. The countdown runs to the moment when the lifeboats become operational, the killbots become truly autonomous, and the richest class decides it no longer needs us as workers, voters, or customers. After that, politics becomes public relations for an emptying planet. We stop them not by mirroring their fear, but by making their endgame obsolete, by making abundance, dignity, and shared sovereignty the default. Because if the rest of humanity doesn't make it, then humanity doesn't make it. And that is one ending we do not accept.